I'm Autumn, 31, and I thought I knew my husband of 8 years better than anyone. When Ryan didn't return from his solo hike during our anniversary camping trip, I spent 3 desperate days believing he was lost somewhere near our campsite. But when the rangers finally found his tent, 50 miles away in a restricted area he'd never mentioned, I realized the man I'd married had been living a lie. The truth about where he went, and why, would shatter everything I believed about our life together. If you've ever discovered that the person closest to you is a stranger, like and subscribe for more stories of hidden truths, and you'll understand the journey I'm about to share. The wedding photo in my wallet felt like it was burning against my chest as I sat in the ranger station, my hands shaking as I dialed search and rescue for the 4th time that morning. Ryan's smile looked back at me from the creased photograph, that same confident grin he'd worn when he kissed me goodbye 3 days ago, promising to be back before sunset. "Ma'am, we've expanded the search radius," Ranger Thompson assured me, but his voice carried that professional distance that meant they were preparing me for the worst. "Your husband's an experienced hiker, right?" I nodded, clutching the photo tighter. Ryan had been hiking since college. He knew these mountains better than our own neighborhood. That's what made his disappearance so terrifying back at our campsite. I tore through his remaining gear with desperate precision. That's when I found his hiking journal, the leather-bound notebook he'd carried on every trip for years. But as I flipped through the recent entries, my blood ran cold. The routes he'd mapped out weren't anywhere near where we'd set up camp. They were locations I'd never heard him mention, marked with cryptic symbols and coordinates that made no sense. "Pine Valley Overlook," I read aloud, my voice cracking. "Devil's Canyon Access Point. Restricted area, check clearance." These weren't casual hiking spots. These were remote, dangerous locations that required special permits. Locations that were 50 miles from where I sat, frantically trying to piece together my husband's last known movements. I called the ranger station again. "I found something," I said, my voice barely steady. "My husband's journal. He was planning to go somewhere completely different than what he told me." The silence on the other end stretched too long. Finally, Ranger Thompson spoke. "Mrs. Walsh, we need you to bring that journal in immediately." As I packed up our campsite with trembling hands, I kept staring at that wedding photo. The man smiling back at me suddenly felt like a stranger. How many other things had Ryan planned without telling me? How many other secrets had he been keeping? The drive to the ranger station felt endless. Every mile that passed made me realize how little I actually knew about the man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years. The journal sat on the passenger seat like evidence of a crime I couldn't yet name. When I handed over the journal, I watched Ranger Thompson's expression change as he read Ryan's notes. His jaw tightened. His eyes grew serious. "Mrs. Walsh," he said carefully, "your husband was planning to access areas that have been off-limits to civilians for the past 6 months. We're going to need to expand our search in a very different direction." That night, alone in a motel room near the park entrance, I stared at our wedding photo until my eyes burned. The Ryan in that picture looked so honest, so open. But the Ryan who'd written those journal entries, the one who'd lied about where he was going, that was someone I was only beginning to meet. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on the 4th day. I knew before I answered that they'd found him, the timing, the formal tone of Ranger Thompson's voice, the way he asked if I was sitting down. "We found your husband, Mrs. Walsh. I'm very sorry." The words hit me like physical blows. Found. Past tense. I gripped the motel room's cheap bedside table until my knuckles went white. "Where?" was all I could manage. "Devil's Canyon, about 53 miles from your campsite. We need you to come in and make a formal identification." The ranger station had transformed into something clinical and cold. Forms. Procedures. Official. Language that turned my husband's death into an administrative task. They handed me a clipboard thick with papers, and at the top of the stack was the death certificate, a stark, government-issued document that reduced 8 years of marriage to a single line: "Cause of death, accidental fall from cliff face." But as I signed form after form, inconsistencies began to gnaw at me. The ranger's report mentioned that Ryan's body was found at the bottom of a 30-foot drop, but his gear was scattered across the canyon floor in a pattern that didn't match a simple fall. His backpack was found nearly 100 yards from his body. His water bottles were empty, even though he'd packed enough for 3 days. "Can I see where you found him?" I asked Ranger Thompson. He exchanged glances with his colleague. "Mrs. Walsh, I don't think that's, I need to see," I interrupted, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "Please." The helicopter ride to Devil's Canyon was the longest 20 minutes of my life. As we descended toward the remote location, I pressed my face against the window, trying to understand why Ryan would have come here alone. The terrain was brutal, jagged rocks, no marked trails, and warning signs posted everywhere about the danger of rockfalls and unstable ground. Standing at the edge of the canyon where they'd found Ryan's body, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't a hiking accident. This was something else entirely. His tent was set up over there. Ranger Thompson pointed to a flat area about a quarter-mile from the cliff edge. Looked like he'd been camping there for at least 2 days before the fall. 2 days? I stared at him. But he was only supposed to be gone for 1 day. He told me he'd be back by sunset. The ranger's expression grew uncomfortable. Mrs. Walsh, based on the evidence we found, your husband had been planning this trip for quite some time. This wasn't a spontaneous detour. Back at the station, I held Ryan's death certificate with numb fingers. The official stamp made it real in a way that nothing else had. But the questions multiplied with every detail I learned. Why had he lied about his destination? Why had he packed for multiple days when he told me he'd be back in hours? And why did every official I spoke with seem to be holding something back? That evening, I sat in my car in the ranger station parking lot, staring at the death certificate. Until the words blurred together. Accidental fall. The phrase felt wrong, like a jacket that didn't fit properly. Ryan was too experienced, too careful. He'd climbed more challenging terrain than Devil's Canyon dozens of times. I folded the certificate carefully and slipped it into my wallet, right next to our wedding photo. 2 pieces of paper that told completely different stories about the same man. One showed me the Ryan I thought I'd married. The other proved that Ryan had died in a place he'd never mentioned, on a trip he'd never told me about, for reasons I was only beginning to suspect I'd never understand. Ryan's camping gear sat in boxes in our garage like evidence from a crime scene I wasn't ready to investigate. For 3 weeks after the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to touch any of it. But the questions that had started at Devil's Canyon wouldn't leave me alone. They whispered to me during sleepless nights and followed me through empty days. Finally, on a gray Thursday afternoon, I pulled on latex gloves, a precaution that felt both ridiculous and necessary, and began examining every piece of equipment the Rangers had returned to me. His backpack was a high-end model I'd never seen before. When I'd asked him about gear for the anniversary trip, he'd shown me his usual day pack. This one was built for serious expeditions, with compartments and features designed for multi-day wilderness survival. It had cost at least $800. When had he bought it? And why had he hidden it from me? I ran my hands along every seam, every pocket, every strap. That's when I felt it, a small, hard rectangle sewn into the back panel's lining. My heart hammered as I carefully cut through the stitching with kitchen scissors. The encrypted USB drive was no bigger than my thumb, wrapped in waterproof plastic and secured with electrical tape. It had been deliberately hidden, sewn into the backpack's structure in a way that would only be discovered by someone looking for it. I stared at the drive for a long time, turning it over in my hands. This wasn't camping equipment. This was spy movie stuff. This was the kind of thing people hid when they had secrets worth killing for. My laptop struggled with the encryption software, but I'd always been good with computers, better than Ryan, actually, though he'd never seemed to mind when I handled our tech problems. It took me 4 hours and 3 different programs, but finally, the drive unlocked. What I found inside made me question everything I thought I knew about my marriage. The drive contained folders labeled with dates going back 2 years. Financial documents. Photographs of people I'd never seen. Email addresses that weren't Ryan's. And spreadsheets, dozens of spreadsheets filled with numbers, locations, and codes that made no sense to me but were clearly significant to someone. I clicked on a folder labeled Route Planning and found detailed maps of the western United States, marked with GPS coordinates and notes written in Ryan's handwriting. But these weren't hiking trails. These were routes between major cities, with timing notations and what looked like delivery schedules. Phoenix to Denver, 14 hours driving. Stop in Flagstaff, usual contact. Seattle to Portland, package pickup Wednesday, delivery Friday AM. Devil's Canyon, final drop. Cleanup required. My hands started shaking as the implications hit me. Ryan hadn't been planning hiking trips. He'd been planning something that required secrecy, careful timing, and enough danger that he'd hidden the evidence in a place where it would only be found if something went wrong. I opened another folder and found photographs that made my stomach lurch. Ryan standing next to expensive cars I'd never seen. Ryan shaking hands with men in business suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a crime drama. Ryan counting stacks of cash in what appeared to be a warehouse. In one photo, he was smiling, that same confident grin from our wedding picture, but his eyes looked different. Harder. Like he was playing a role instead of just being himself. The dates on the photos overlapped with times I remembered clearly. Business trips. Weekend camping expeditions. Late nights at the office. All those times when Ryan had been mysteriously unreachable for hours, claiming his phone had died or he'd been in an area with no service. I'd trusted him completely. I'd never questioned his explanations, never demanded details, never pushed when he seemed evasive. I'd been proud of myself for being the kind of wife who gave her husband space and independence. Now I realized I'd been the perfect cover for whatever Ryan had really been doing. As I scrolled through document after document, one thing became crystal clear: the man I'd mourned at his funeral wasn't the man who died in Devil's Canyon. The Ryan I'd married had been a carefully constructed facade, and the real Ryan, the one who'd hidden encrypted drives and planned mysterious routes and met with dangerous-looking strangers, had been living a completely separate life right under my nose. The coded email exchange that would destroy my world was buried in a folder labeled Work Correspondence. At first glance, the messages looked like routine business communications. But as I read more carefully, the bland corporate language revealed something sinister underneath. The emails were between Ryan and someone identified only as Falcon. The messages went back 18 months, and they told the story of my husband's double life in clinical, businesslike detail. Package secured from Phoenix supplier. Quality exceptional as promised. Delivery schedule unchanged, Tuesday a.m. at designated location. Payment processed through usual channels. Excellent work. Next shipment arrives Thursday. Same specifications. Double quantity. Falcon will handle distribution logistics. Your route remains Devil's Canyon to Denver. Maintain radio silence until completion. I read the exchange 3 times before the full meaning hit me. Ryan had been running drugs. Not using them, not accidentally involved, actively transporting illegal substances across state lines for what appeared to be a sophisticated criminal network. The financial implications became clear as I dug deeper into the files. Bank statements for accounts I'd never known existed showed deposits that dwarfed Ryan's supposed salary from his consulting job. $50,000 here. $30,000 there. All cash deposits, all precisely timed with the delivery schedules mentioned in his correspondence. Our comfortable life, the house we'd bought 2 years ago, the new car Ryan had surprised me with last Christmas, the expensive anniversary trip that had ended with his death, it had all been funded by drug money. I felt physically sick as I calculated the amounts. In 18 months, Ryan had moved nearly $500,000 through accounts I'd never seen. Money that had allowed us to live far beyond our supposed means while I remained completely oblivious to its source. But the most devastating discovery was in the final email exchange, dated just 3 days before our camping trip. Situation complicated. Law enforcement asking questions about Phoenix route. Recommend temporary suspension of operations until heat dies down. Too late for suspension. Already committed to final delivery. After Devil's Canyon run, I'm out permanently. Have enough saved to disappear if necessary. Don't try to contact me after Tuesday. Disappearing is not an option. You know too much about operations. Complete Devil's Canyon delivery as planned. We'll discuss your future involvement afterward. You don't understand. I'm done with this life. The money isn't worth it anymore. After this last run, I'm telling my wife everything and we're starting over somewhere else. Your wife is not a factor in this decision. Complete the delivery. That's an order, not a request. The blood drained from my face as I realized what I was reading. Ryan hadn't gone to Devil's Canyon for a peaceful hike. He'd gone there to complete one final drug delivery, and apparently to double-cross the people who'd been paying him. The last email in the thread was sent the morning Ryan died, package delivered as instructed. Money transferred to secure account. This is my final communication. Do not attempt to trace me. I'm disappearing permanently. Consider our business relationship terminated. But Falcon's response, sent just 2 hours later, chilled me to the bone. Nobody leaves our organization voluntarily. Your location is known. Your wife's location is known. Reconsider your position before we reconsider ours. You have 24 hours to respond to this message. Ryan never responded. 12 hours later, he was dead at the bottom of Devil's Canyon. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by printouts of emails that proved my husband had been living a lie for nearly 2 years. The Ryan I'd mourned wasn't just a stranger, he was a criminal who'd put both our lives in danger with his choices. But the most terrifying realization was still sinking in. If Falcon's threats were real, if Ryan's death wasn't an accident, then I was now the widow of a dead drug courier who'd tried to steal from dangerous people, and they knew where I lived. The fake driver's license was hidden behind our wedding photo in Ryan's wallet, a detail so sickeningly symbolic that I actually laughed out loud when I found it. A bitter, broken sound that echoed through our empty house. Connor Hayes. That's who my husband had been when he wasn't being Ryan Walsh. The photo was unmistakably Ryan, but everything else was fabricated. A Phoenix address I'd never heard of. A birth date that was wrong by 3 years. An organ donor status that contradicted his real medical records. Connor Hayes had a credit rating. Connor Hayes had rental agreements. Connor Hayes had a whole financial Existence that existed parallel to the life I'd shared with my supposedly loving husband. The documentation was sophisticated, not the kind of amateur identity theft you read about in the news, but professional-grade false identification that would pass most background checks. Someone had invested serious money in creating Connor Hayes, which meant Ryan's criminal activities were far more extensive than I'd imagined. I found Connor's bank records tucked inside a manila envelope that had been taped to the bottom of Ryan's desk drawer. The statements revealed a staggering pattern of deposits and withdrawals that corresponded exactly with the dates in his coded emails. Over the past 2 years, Connor Hayes had moved more than $700,000 through various accounts, but the most shocking discovery was how much money was still unaccounted for. According to the records, Connor had made regular transfers to something called Secure Holdings LLC, a total of nearly $200,000 that seemed to have vanished into thin air. I spent hours researching Secure Holdings online, but the company barely existed. A basic website with no contact information. A registered address that turned out to be a mail forwarding service. Whatever Ryan had done with that money, he'd hidden it even from his criminal associates. The rental agreements told another disturbing story. Connor Hayes had been paying for a storage unit in Phoenix, a post office box in Denver, and what appeared to be a safe house in Nevada. All locations along the drug routes I'd found mapped on his encrypted drive. As I pieced together Connor's life, I began to understand the methodical nature of Ryan's deception. This wasn't a man who'd stumbled into criminal activity. This was someone who'd systematically constructed an alternate identity to support a long-term illegal operation. The dates revealed that Connor Hayes had been born just 3 months after Ryan and I got married. While I'd been settling into what I thought was domestic bliss, my husband had been creating the infrastructure for a criminal career. Every business trip, every weekend camping expedition, every time Ryan had claimed he needed space to clear his head or work on client projects, he'd been building Connor Hayes' life while systematically lying to mine. I found Connor's phone records, and the call log made me physically ill. Hundreds of calls to numbers I didn't recognize, many lasting just seconds, the kind of brief communications that suggested coded messages or confirmations. But what broke my heart were the calls to our home number, made from Connor's phone. To the house where I'd been waiting for Ryan to come home. He'd been calling me from his fake identity, pretending to be my husband calling from a business trip, while actually coordinating drug deliveries as Connor Hayes. The betrayal was so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that I started questioning every memory of our marriage. Had Ryan ever loved me, or had I simply been useful cover for his criminal activities? Had our entire relationship been a lie designed to make Connor Hayes look more legitimate? I stared at Connor's driver's license until the face became unfamiliar. This was the man who died in Devil's Canyon. This was the man who'd stolen from dangerous criminals and put my life at risk. The Ryan Walsh I thought I'd married had never really existed at all. As I sat surrounded by evidence of my husband's double life, one thing became crystal clear: Connor Hayes had enemies who didn't know he was dead. And as far as they were concerned, Ryan Walsh's widow was the only person who might know where Connor had hidden their money. The burner phone was hidden in a place that revealed just how paranoid Ryan had become in his final weeks. I found it duct-taped inside the spare tire well of his car, wrapped in plastic and sealed in a waterproof container that suggested he'd expected to need it in an emergency. The phone was a basic model, the kind you could buy with cash at any convenience store. But when I powered it on, the message history told the story of Ryan's final days in stark, terrifying detail. The last text message had been sent at 11:47 a.m. on the day he died. Package delivered. Meet at usual spot tomorrow. The response came just minutes later. Location confirmed. Bring everything. But there was another message, sent 3 hours after Ryan was already dead. You missed the meeting. This was a mistake. We're coming to find you. My hands shook as I scrolled through earlier messages. The conversation revealed that Ryan had been playing a dangerous game in his final weeks, making promises to his criminal associates while secretly planning to disappear with their money. Need to move the timeline up. Ryan had texted 5 days before he died. Law enforcement activity increasing. Recommend we complete all operations and shut down for 6 months. Timeline doesn't change, came the reply. You complete Devil's Canyon delivery as scheduled. No early retirement. You don't understand. I have family to protect. I can't keep doing this. Your family is exactly why you'll keep doing this. Complete the delivery. The threat was clear, and it explained why Ryan had been so tense in the weeks before our anniversary trip. He'd been trapped between his desire to get out of the drug business and the criminals who wouldn't let him leave, but Ryan had made a choice that sealed his fate. According to the message history, he'd agreed to the Devil's Canyon delivery, but he'd never intended to turn over the drugs or the money to his associates. Meeting location changed. He'd texted the morning he died. Devil's Canyon, GPS coordinates attached. Come alone. This is not the agreed location, came the response. Take it or leave it. Final offer. The GPS coordinates Ryan had sent led to a remote area of Devil's Canyon that was nearly inaccessible by vehicle, a location where someone could easily be trapped if they weren't familiar with the terrain. I realized that Ryan hadn't gone to Devil's Canyon to complete a drug delivery. He'd gone there to steal the money and disappear, using the isolated location to give himself an advantage over the criminals who were hunting him, but something had gone wrong. Against every instinct that told me to stay safe, I knew I had to see Devil's Canyon again. The official investigation had concluded that Ryan died in a hiking accident, but the text messages proved that he'd been meeting with dangerous people in that remote location. The drive back to the canyon took 4 hours. And with every mile, I questioned my sanity. But I needed to understand what had really happened to my husband, even if the truth was more dangerous than the lie. The usual spot, mentioned in the text messages, turned out to be a flat area about half a mile from where Ryan's body had been found. When I arrived, I could see why he'd chosen it. The location was hidden from the main canyon but accessible by a rough dirt road that most tourists would never find. Evidence of recent activity was everywhere. Tire tracks from multiple vehicles, cigarette butts ground into the dirt, and scattered across the canyon floor, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were small plastic bags and drug paraphernalia that the official investigation had apparently missed. This hadn't been a hiking accident. This had been a drug deal gone wrong, and Ryan had died trying to escape from people who discovered his plan to betray them. As I stood in the spot where my husband had spent his final moments, the full horror of the situation hit me. Ryan hadn't fallen from a cliff while hiking. He'd been murdered by the criminals he'd tried to double-cross, and his death had been staged to look like an accident. But if the people who killed Ryan thought he'd hidden their money somewhere, and if they believed his widow might know where it was, then my nightmare was just beginning. The photograph that shattered my last illusions about Ryan was hidden in a folder labeled "Insurance" on his encrypted drive. At first, I thought it was just another piece of evidence about his criminal activities. Then I recognized the faces, and my world collapsed completely. The photo showed Ryan standing with 3 men outside what appeared to be a warehouse. All 4 were smiling, relaxed, like old friends celebrating a successful business deal. Ryan had his arm around the shoulders of a man with a neck tattoo and dead eyes who looked like he'd stepped out of a maximum security prison, but it was the timestamp that made me dizzy with fear. The photo had been taken just 2 weeks before Ryan died. This wasn't ancient history, this was recent, active criminal association. I used reverse image search to try to identify Ryan's companions, and what I found made me understand why he'd been so paranoid in his final weeks. The man with the neck tattoo was Vincent Mora, a convicted drug trafficker who'd been released from federal prison 8 months ago. The thin, well-dressed man standing next to him was allegedly connected to a Phoenix-based money laundering operation that had been under FBI investigation for 3 years. These weren't small-time criminals. Ryan had been working with serious, dangerous people who had the resources and connections to make problems, and people, disappear permanently. As I dug deeper into Ryan's files, I found more photographs that revealed the scope of his criminal network. Images of warehouse meetings, handoffs in parking lots, and what appeared to be a sophisticated drug distribution operation spanning multiple states. But the most terrifying discovery was evidence that Ryan had been trying to get out of the business for months before his death. I found draft emails he'd never sent, pleading with his associates to let him retire. Messages explaining that he wanted to go straight, that he was tired of living a double life, that he just wanted to be a normal husband. "I can't keep lying to my wife," one draft read. "She deserves better than this. I want out, and I'm willing to pay whatever exit fee you require." But the responses from his criminal associates made it clear that leaving wasn't an option. They knew too much about his operations, and he knew too much about theirs. In their world, retirement meant death. The final piece of the puzzle was a series of financial documents that showed Ryan had been systematically skimming money from drug proceeds for nearly 6 months. Not large amounts, just enough to build an escape fund without attracting immediate attention. The money had been transferred to accounts under Connor Hayes' name, then moved again to offshore holdings that would be nearly impossible for his criminal associates to trace. By the time of his death, Ryan had stolen nearly $300,000 from the drug operation, but he'd made a fatal miscalculation. The same meticulous record-keeping that had allowed him to steal the money had also created a paper trail that his associates could follow. They knew he'd been skimming, and they knew approximately how much he'd taken. The threatening messages I'd found on his burner phone suddenly made more sense. His criminal partners hadn't just been angry about Ryan's desire to leave the business, they'd been trying to recover the money he'd stolen from them. I found evidence that they'd been tracking Ryan's movements in his final weeks, monitoring his bank accounts, and pressuring him to return the stolen funds. When he'd agreed to the Devil's Canyon meeting, they'd probably thought he was finally ready to cooperate. Instead, Ryan had used the meeting as an opportunity to fake his own death and disappear with their money. But something had gone wrong. And instead of escaping, he'd ended up dead at the bottom of the canyon. The most chilling realization was that Ryan's death hadn't solved his associate's problem. The money was still missing, and as far as they knew, I was the only person who might know where Ryan had hidden it. According to the documents I'd found, the criminal network Ryan had worked with was still active, still looking for their missing money, and still convinced that Ryan's widow was their best lead to recovering what he'd stolen. I wasn't just mourning a husband who'd lied to me for years. I was being hunted by dangerous criminals who believed I had information that could cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the most terrifying part was that they might be right. Hidden somewhere in Ryan's carefully constructed double life was $300,000 in stolen drug money, and I was the only person left alive who might be able to find it. The hand-drawn map was folded inside Ryan's personal copy of Wilderness Survival, a book I'd seen him read dozens of times but never thought to examine closely. When I opened it that night, desperate to find answers before his criminal associates found me, the map fell out like a confession. Ryan's careful handwriting marked locations across 3 states, Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado, with GPS coordinates, depth measurements, and cryptic notes that read like a treasure hunter's guide to buried fortune. Site A, 6 feet north of lightning-struck pine, 3 feet down. $45,000. Site B, behind boulder formation shaped like eagle, metal box waterproofed. $62,000. Site C, Devil's Canyon overlook, 50 yards east of Ranger warning sign, shallow grave. $89,000. My husband had been burying cash across the western United States like a paranoid survivalist preparing for the apocalypse. But this wasn't preparation, this was theft, carefully planned and methodically executed over months of criminal activity. The total amount marked on the map was staggering, nearly $300,000 hidden in remote locations that would take weeks to find, even with detailed directions. Ryan had been preparing for this moment, the moment when he'd need to disappear completely and start a new life with stolen money. But the most shocking revelation was the note written in the map's margin: "For Autumn, if something happens to me, I'm sorry for everything. This is your insurance policy. Use it to disappear. Trust no one." He'd known he was going to die. In his final weeks, Ryan had realized that his criminal associates would never let him leave their organization alive, so he'd created this map as a final gift to me, blood money that would allow me to escape the dangerous situation his choices had created. The emotional impact was devastating. Even in death, even after betraying me for years, Ryan had been trying to protect me. The money he'd stolen wasn't just an escape fund for himself, it was meant to be my survival kit if his double life ever caught up with us, but taking the money would make me as guilty as Ryan had been. Every dollar he'd buried was connected to drug trafficking, to violence, to the destruction of countless lives. Using it would make me complicit in crimes I'd never chosen to commit, yet as I studied the map, I realized I might not have a choice. The criminals hunting me weren't going to disappear just because I maintained my moral principles. They wanted their money back, and they believed I knew where it was. In a sense, they were right. I was holding a map to nearly $300,000 in stolen drug money, and whether I used it or not, its existence made me a target. The location marked Site C made my blood run cold. Devil's Canyon overlook, just 50 yards from where the Rangers had found Ryan's body. He'd hidden nearly $90,000 practically at the scene of his own murder, which meant his killers had been standing on top of their own money while they dumped his body over the cliff. The irony was both bitter and strategic. Ryan had hidden the largest cash in the one place his criminal associates would never think to look, the site of their own crime. I spent the entire night studying the map, memorizing coordinates and landmarks, understanding that this piece of paper was simultaneously my death warrant and my only hope for survival. If Ryan's associates found out I had it, they'd kill me for it. But if I could reach the buried money before they found me, I might have enough resources to disappear permanently. The moral complexity was crushing. Using the money would make me a criminal, but not using it might get me killed. Ryan had left me with an impossible choice between principles and survival. As dawn broke through my kitchen window, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I wasn't going to run, and I wasn't going to hide. I was going to use Ryan's map, but not the way he'd intended. If his criminal associates wanted their money back, I was going to find it for them. But I was going to make sure they paid a price that would destroy their entire operation. The money Ryan had stolen was evidence of federal crimes. Used properly, it could bring down the entire drug network he'd been part of. His death could mean something more than just another casualty in the drug war. I folded the map carefully and slipped it into the same wallet where I kept our wedding photo and Ryan's death certificate. 3 pieces of paper that told the complete story of our marriage, the love I'd thought we shared, the death that had ended it, and the criminal legacy that would either destroy me or set me free. The threatening note was tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket, but the message was far more sinister than any traffic violation. We know you have it. Give it back or join him. I found it when I came out of the grocery store. On a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after discovering Ryan's treasure map. My hands shook as I read the simple, terrifying message. They'd found me. Despite all my precautions, despite my careful routine and constant vigilance, Ryan's criminal associates had tracked me down. The note was typed on plain white paper, giving no clues about who had written it or how long they'd been watching me. But the fact that they'd been close enough to touch my car meant they could get close enough to hurt me whenever they chose. I drove home in a state of controlled panic, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds and taking a circuitous route through residential neighborhoods to make sure I wasn't being followed. But the damage was done. They knew where I lived, where I shopped, probably where I worked. My normal life was over. At home, I found more evidence of their surveillance. Subtle signs that someone had been in my house while I was gone, a kitchen drawer left slightly open, magazines on the coffee table arranged differently than I'd left them, the spare key moved a fraction of an inch from its hiding place. They'd been inside my home, searching for the money they believed I'd hidden. The violation felt almost as traumatic as losing Ryan. These strangers had been touching my belongings, going through my private spaces, looking for evidence of crimes I'd never committed, but they hadn't found what they were looking for, which meant they'd be back. The note under my windshield wasn't just a threat, it was an ultimatum with an unspoken deadline. I packed quickly, throwing essentials into a duffel bag while trying to think clearly about my next move. Staying in the house was suicide. Running without a plan was almost as dangerous. But I had something they didn't know about, Ryan's map to the buried money. The irony wasn't lost on me. The treasure map that Ryan had intended as my insurance policy was now my only bargaining chip with the criminals who wanted to kill me. If I could find the money before they found me, I might be able to negotiate my way out of this nightmare. I left the house through the back door, cutting through my neighbor's yard and emerging 3 blocks away where I'd parked a rental car I'd gotten under my maiden name. It was paranoid preparation that had seemed excessive when I'd done it a week ago, but now felt like the smartest decision I'd ever made. The drive to Devil's Canyon took 6 hours, and I spent every mile expecting to see dangerous men in my rearview mirror. But the map's first location was the most accessible, Site C, where Ryan had buried nearly $90,000 just 50 yards from where he died. Finding the cache was easier than I'd expected. Ryan's directions were precise, and the metal box was exactly where he'd marked it on the map. As I dug through 3 feet of rocky soil with a folding shovel I'd bought at a hardware store, I kept thinking about the brutal irony of the situation. Ryan had buried this money as evidence of his betrayal of dangerous criminals. Now I was digging it up as evidence that might save my life or end it, depending on how I used what I'd found. The metal box contained vacuum-sealed packages of cash, all hundreds, all perfectly preserved. $89,000 in stolen drug money that represented months of Ryan's systematic theft from people who killed for far less provocation. But as I loaded the money into my rental car, I realized that finding it had only made my situation more dangerous. Now I was in possession of evidence that could destroy Ryan's former associates, which made me an even bigger threat to their operation than they'd originally believed. The chase was just beginning, and I was running out of places to hide. Ryan's insurance policy wasn't the stolen money, it was the flash drive I found buried with the cash at Devil's Canyon, wrapped in waterproof plastic and labeled with a single word that changed everything: evidence. The drive contained files that made Ryan's criminal associates look like amateurs compared to the systematic intelligence operation he'd been running. For 18 months, my husband had been documenting every aspect of the drug network he'd worked for, creating a comprehensive record of their operations that would be worth millions to law enforcement: names, addresses, phone numbers, financial records, shipping schedules, supplier contacts, distribution networks. Ryan had collected enough evidence to bring down dozens of criminals across multiple states. He hadn't just been a drug courier, he'd been an undercover investigator building a case that could destroy the entire organization. The scope of his documentation was staggering. Photographs of drug labs, recordings of conversations with high-level traffickers, copies of financial transactions that proved money laundering on a massive scale. Ryan had been preparing for war against his former associates, and he'd armed himself with weapons that could destroy them legally. But the most shocking discovery was a series of encrypted audio files recorded in the weeks before his death. In them, I could hear Ryan meeting with someone who was clearly a federal agent, discussing his role as an informant and his plans to bring down the drug network from within. "I've been feeding you information for 8 months," Ryan's voice said. "On one recording. I've given you enough evidence to arrest 30 people and seize millions in assets. When do I get to stop living this double life?" "When we're certain we have the entire network," came the response. "Your position gives us access to information we can't get any other way. We need you to stay in place for a few more months." "A few more months could get me killed. These people are already suspicious. I think they're starting to figure out that someone's been talking to law enforcement. We'll protect you. Trust the process." But the process had failed. Ryan had been murdered before he could testify, and his federal handlers had apparently decided that protecting their informant wasn't worth compromising their investigation. The final audio file was recorded just 2 days before Ryan's death. And it revealed the desperate situation he'd found himself in. "They know," Ryan's voice was tight with fear. "I don't know how, but they know I've been talking to you. They're planning something for the Devil's Canyon delivery. This might be my last communication. We can extract you right now. Just say the word. No. If I disappear, they'll know for certain that I was the informant. They'll scatter, and you'll lose everything we've worked for. I'm going to complete the delivery and try to maintain my cover. But if something happens to me, everything you need is in the insurance files. My wife's name is Autumn Walsh. She's completely innocent in all of this. Make sure she's protected." I sat in my rental car, crying as I listened to my husband's final words. He hadn't been just a criminal, he'd been an undercover informant trying to bring down dangerous people from within. His death hadn't been the result of a drug deal gone wrong, it had been the assassination of a federal witness, but his federal handlers had apparently decided that his death was an acceptable loss. They'd made no effort to contact me, no attempt to protect me from the criminals who were now hunting me, no acknowledgement that their informant had died trying to help them. The evidence Ryan had died collecting was my leverage against both sides, the criminals who wanted to kill me and the federal agents who'd abandoned me. With these files, I could destroy the drug network that had murdered my husband. But I could also expose the federal investigation that had gotten him killed. For the first time since finding that threatening note on my car, I felt a spark of hope. I wasn't just a victim running from dangerous criminals. I was the widow of a federal informant, and I had evidence that could bring justice for Ryan's murder while protecting me from his former associates, but using the evidence would require careful strategy. I needed to approach law enforcement in a way that would force them to take me seriously while ensuring my own safety. I needed to make myself more valuable alive than dead to both the criminals and the federal agents. The insurance policy Ryan had left me wasn't money, it was power. The power to destroy his killers and the power to expose the federal agents who'd failed to protect him. As I drove away from Devil's Canyon with Ryan's evidence files, I felt something I hadn't experienced since his death, a sense of purpose. I was going to finish what my husband had started, but I was going to do it on my own terms. The wire recording device felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds against my chest as I walked into the warehouse where Ryan's killers had agreed to meet me. The FBI had given me the equipment reluctantly, after I'd convinced them that I was their only chance to get a confession that would stand up in court. "This is extremely dangerous," Agent Martinez had warned me during our briefing. "These people killed your husband when they suspected he was talking to us. If they discover you're wearing a wire, they won't hesitate to kill you too." But I'd made my choice. Running and hiding wasn't enough anymore. I wanted justice for Ryan, and I wanted to end the nightmare his criminal associates had created for me. The warehouse was exactly what I'd expected, a cavernous space filled with shadows. And the smell of motor oil, the kind of place where people disappeared permanently. 3 men were waiting for me in the center of the space, and I recognized 2 of them from the photographs I'd found on Ryan's encrypted drive. Vincent Mora, the man with the neck tattoo, stepped forward as I approached. His dead eyes studied me with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. "Mrs. Walsh," he said, his voice surprisingly cultured for someone who looked like a career criminal. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your husband was a valued member of our organization. Until he tried to steal from you," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Mora smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Ryan made some poor choices in his final weeks. Business relationships require trust, and unfortunately, your husband violated that trust in ways that couldn't be overlooked. So you killed him." "Your husband died in a hiking accident," Mora said carefully. "The official investigation concluded that he fell from a cliff. Very tragic. Very unfortunate." But I could see the truth in his eyes. He was enjoying this, the power, the control, the opportunity to torment the widow of a man they'd murdered. "I found the money," I said, getting straight to the point. "All of it. Ryan left me detailed instructions about where he'd hidden what he stole from you." The atmosphere in the warehouse shifted immediately. The other 2 men moved closer, and I could feel their attention focusing on me with dangerous intensity. How much? Maura asked. Nearly $300,000, buried in locations across 3 states. Ryan was more systematic than you probably realized. And you're willing to give it back? I'm willing to make a deal. Maura laughed, a sound like breaking glass. You're not in a position to make deals, Mrs. Walsh. You're in a position to return stolen property and hope we let you live. Actually, I'm in a much stronger position than you think, I said, pulling out my phone and showing him a photograph. That's you and Ryan and 2 other men outside a Phoenix warehouse 6 months ago. I have dozens of photos like this, along with financial records, shipping schedules, and audio recordings of your conversations. The temperature in the warehouse seemed to drop 10 degrees. Maura's expression went from amused to lethal in seconds. Ryan was documenting your entire operation, I continued. Names, dates, locations, financial transactions. Everything law enforcement would need to destroy your network permanently. If you had evidence like that, you would have gone to the police already, Maura said, but I could hear uncertainty in his voice. I did go to the police, I replied. In fact, they're listening to this conversation right now. The wire taped to my chest felt like it was burning against my skin as I watched. The realization hit all 3 men simultaneously. Maura's hand moved toward his jacket, and I knew he was reaching for a gun. The warehouse is surrounded, I said quickly. FBI agents have been in position since before I arrived. You can kill me, but you'll be dead or in prison within minutes. You're bluffing, Maura snarled, but his hand stopped moving toward his weapon. Ryan was a federal informant for 8 months before you killed him, I said, the words coming out in a rush. He collected evidence about your drug operation, your money laundering, your distribution network. Everything I found after his death has been turned over to the FBI. This conversation is just the final piece they needed to arrest everyone involved. The confession I needed came exactly as Agent Martinez had predicted it would. When criminals realize they're trapped, they often reveal more than they intend to in their anger and desperation. That son of a bitch, Maura exploded. I knew he was talking to someone. When we found out he was stealing money, we figured that was his only betrayal. But he was recording us the entire time. You killed him in Devil's Canyon, I pressed. We killed a rat who was trying to destroy our operation, Maura admitted. And we staged it to look like an accident because we're not amateurs. The wire captured every word, every admission, every detail that would convict them of Ryan's murder. But as I stood there listening to them describe how they'd killed my husband, I realized that getting the confession was only half the battle. Now I had to survive long enough for the FBI to use it. The court testimony transcript lay before me like a record of the most difficult day of my life, but reading it 6 months later filled me with a sense of closure I hadn't expected to feel. State your name for the record, the prosecutor had asked. Autumn Walsh. I was married to Ryan Walsh, who was murdered by the defendants on March 15 in Devil's Canyon. The courtroom had been packed with reporters, federal agents, and family members of other victims of the drug network Ryan had helped expose. But all I could focus on was Vincent Maura sitting at the defendant's table, his dead eyes fixed on me. With barely contained rage. My testimony had lasted 3 hours, during which I'd described Ryan's double life, the evidence I'd found after his death, and the confession I'd recorded in the warehouse. The wire recording had been played for the jury, and I'd watched their faces change as they heard Maura admit to staging Ryan's death as a hiking accident. Mrs. Walsh, the defense attorney had asked during cross-examination, isn't it true that your husband was a criminal who betrayed his associates for money? My husband was a federal informant who risked his life to gather evidence against dangerous criminals, I'd replied. He was murdered because he was helping law enforcement protect innocent people from the defendant's drug operation. The trial had taken 4 months, during which I'd lived under federal protection while the full scope of Ryan's investigation became clear. The evidence he'd collected had led to the arrest of 37 people across 6 states, the seizure of $12 million in assets, and the destruction of one of the largest drug networks in the southwestern United States, but the personal cost had been staggering. My life as I'd known it was over. The house Ryan and I had shared was sold to pay legal expenses. Our friends had drifted away, uncomfortable with the media attention and the criminal associations. I'd lost my job when my employer decided that having an employee connected to a major drug case was bad for business. The trial's conclusion had brought justice but not peace. Maura and his associates were sentenced to life in prison without parole for Ryan's murder, along with additional sentences for drug trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering. But their convictions couldn't give me back the husband I'd lost or the life I'd thought we'd built together. The media attention had been relentless. Reporters had portrayed me as either a heroic widow who'd brought down dangerous criminals or a naive woman who'd been oblivious to her husband's double life. Neither narrative felt accurate, but I'd learned to live with other people's versions of my story. The financial consequences had been almost as devastating as the emotional ones. The government had seized all of Ryan's assets as proceeds of criminal activity, including the house we'd lived in and the cars we'd driven. The money I'd found buried in Devil's Canyon had been returned to the federal evidence locker, leaving me with nothing but the savings from my own legitimate income, starting over at 31 with no assets, no home, and a criminal case that followed me everywhere had been humbling in ways I'd never imagined. But it had also been liberating. For the first time in years, every dollar I earned was clean money, every relationship I built was based on honesty, and every decision I made was entirely my own. The survivor's guilt had been the hardest part to overcome. Ryan had died trying to bring down criminals who were destroying lives with their drug operation, but I'd lived to see justice done. Why had I survived when he hadn't? Why had I been given the chance to rebuild when his life had been cut short? Therapy had helped me understand that survival wasn't something to feel guilty about, it was something to be grateful for and to use responsibly. Ryan's death had meaning because his evidence had stopped criminals from hurting other people. My survival had meaning because I could honor his sacrifice by building a life that justified the price he'd paid. The testimony transcript ended with my final words to the jury: my husband died because he chose to fight against people who profit from human misery. His death won't bring back the lives destroyed by their drugs, but his evidence will prevent them from destroying more lives in the future. That's his legacy, and that's why his sacrifice mattered. As I folded the transcript and put it away, I realized that those words were still true 6 months later. Ryan's death had achieved something his life never could have: the complete destruction of the criminal network he'd infiltrated. Justice had been served, even if the cost had been higher than either of us had ever imagined. The therapy journal I'd started writing 6 months after the trial became my lifeline during the darkest period of my recovery. Reading through those early entries now, I could see the journey from victim to survivor mapped out in my own handwriting. Day 1, I don't know how to be a person without being Ryan's wife. Every decision I made for 8 years was influenced by what I thought he needed, what he wanted, what would make him happy. Now I have to figure out what I want, and I don't even know where to start. Dr. Sarah Chen, my therapist, not to be confused with any of the dangerous people from my past, had encouraged me to write daily as a way of processing the complex emotions that came with discovering your entire life had been built on lies. Grief is complicated enough when you're mourning someone you truly knew, she'd explained during one of our early sessions. But you're grieving multiple losses simultaneously: the husband you thought you had, the marriage you believed in, the future you'd planned, and your sense of your own judgment. The early entries in my journal were filled with rage and self-recrimination. How could I have been so blind? How could I have lived with someone for 8 years without recognizing that he was living a double life? What did it say about me that I'd been completely oblivious to my husband's criminal activities? Day 15, I keep thinking about all the signs I missed. The unexplained income that allowed us to live beyond our means. The business trips that never quite made sense. The way he'd changed the subject when I asked too many questions about his work. I thought I was being a supportive wife by giving him space. Really, I was being a convenient cover for his illegal activities. But gradually, with Dr. Chen's help, I began to understand that I hadn't been naive, I'd been manipulated by someone who was skilled at deception. Ryan had spent years carefully constructing a false identity designed to fool not just me, but federal agents, criminals, and everyone else in his complicated life. Day 45, Dr. Chen asked me today if I thought the Ryan I fell in love with was completely fake. I've been thinking about that question for hours. The man who held me when I cried, who laughed at my terrible jokes, who remembered my birthday and our anniversary, was that person real, or was it all performance? I think maybe the truth is somewhere in between. Maybe Ryan was playing a role so long that he forgot who he really was. The financial struggles that came with starting over had been humbling but also clarifying. Without Ryan's illegal income, I had to rebuild my life on a budget that reflected my actual earning potential rather than the inflated lifestyle his criminal activities had funded. I'd moved into a studio apartment in a part of town I'd previously considered beneath me. I'd sold most of our possessions, the ones the government hadn't seized, and learned to live with secondhand furniture and basic necessities. But there was something liberating about knowing that every object in my space had been purchased with clean money. Day 73, I bought groceries today with money I earned at my new job, and it felt different than it used to. When Ryan was paying for everything, I always felt like I owed him something, even though I couldn't have said what. Now every dollar is mine because I worked for it. Poverty with dignity feels better than comfort built on lies. The trust issues had been the hardest to work through. If I'd been so wrong about the person closest to me, how could I trust my judgment about anyone else? How could I build new relationships when I'd proven to be such a poor judge of character? Day 120. Started a conversation with the man who works at the coffee shop near my apartment. Nothing romantic, just friendly small talk about the weather and the neighborhood. But afterwards, I found myself analyzing every word he'd said, looking for signs that he might be lying about something. Dr. Chen says this hypervigilance is normal after what I've been through, but it's exhausting to live like this. Slowly, with careful practice and Dr. Chen's guidance, I began to learn the difference between reasonable caution and paranoid fear. Not everyone was hiding criminal secrets. Not every inconsistency was evidence of a double life. Most people were exactly who they appeared to be. Day 180. I think I'm finally starting to understand that Ryan's deception says more about him than it does about me. I was a good wife to the man I thought he was. I can't blame myself for not recognizing a performance that was designed to fool everyone who encountered it. My job now isn't to become a human lie detector, it's to heal from the damage his lies caused and learn to trust myself again. The journal entries from my first year of therapy showed a gradual transformation from self-blame to self-compassion, from isolation to cautious engagement with the world, from victim to survivor. The final entry from that period captured the moment when I realized I was ready to move forward. Day 365. A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought Ryan's death and the discovery of his lies had destroyed everything I was and everything I could become. But sitting here in my little apartment, surrounded by things I chose and paid for myself, I realized that his death didn't end my story, it just forced me to start writing a new chapter. The job offer letter from the Victim Advocacy Center arrived on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other day, but it would mark the beginning of my transformation from survivor to advocate. Dear Ms. Walsh, the letter began, based on your personal experience and your testimony in the Mora case, we believe you would be uniquely qualified to help other victims of crime navigate the criminal justice system. I'd applied for the position almost as therapy. Dr. Chen had suggested that finding ways to help others might give meaning to my own traumatic experience. But I hadn't expected to be seriously considered. My resume was thin, my recent history was complicated, and I had no formal training in victim advocacy. The interview had been unlike anything I'd experienced in my previous corporate life. Instead of discussing quarterly projections and marketing strategies, I found myself talking about trauma, recovery, and the practical challenges of rebuilding a life after catastrophic loss. What would you say to someone who just discovered that their spouse had been living a double life? The director asked. I'd tell them that it's not their fault, I replied without hesitation. I'd tell them that being deceived doesn't make them stupid or naive, it makes them human. And I'd tell them that the person who lied to them doesn't get to define who they are or who they can become. The work was emotionally demanding in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every client who walked through our doors carried a story of betrayal, violence, or loss that resonated with my own experience. But instead of triggering my trauma, helping others seemed to heal something in me that individual therapy hadn't been able to reach. My first client was Maria, a young mother whose husband had been murdered during a robbery. She came to our office 3 weeks after the funeral, overwhelmed by police procedures, insurance claims, and the practical details of widowhood that no one prepares you for. I don't understand anything they're telling me, she said, clutching a stack of legal documents with shaking hands. They keep using words like restitution and victim impact statement, but nobody explains what any of it means. Sitting across from Maria, I saw myself 18 months earlier, confused, angry, and struggling to navigate systems that seemed designed to re-victimize people who were already suffering. But I also saw something I hadn't recognized in myself at the time: incredible strength disguised as vulnerability. You're stronger than you think you are, I told her, and I meant it. The system is complicated and often cruel, but you don't have to navigate it alone. I'm going to help you understand every step of the process, and I'm going to make sure your voice is heard. Working with victims taught me to spot the red flags I'd missed in my own marriage. The isolation tactics, the financial control, the way abusers undermined their victims' confidence in their own perceptions. I began to understand that Ryan's deception had been more systematic than I'd realized. He convinced me that I was bad with money. One client told me about her abusive ex-husband. Every time I questioned our expenses, he'd remind me of some financial mistake I'd made years ago. Eventually, I stopped asking questions about anything. I recognized the pattern immediately. Ryan had never called me bad with money, but he'd handled all our major financial decisions while praising me for being too trusting and too generous to worry about practical matters. His compliments had been subtle forms of control, designed to keep me from looking too closely at our income and expenses, but the most rewarding part of the work was watching clients discover their own strength. The widow who learned to manage her finances independently. The assault survivor who found the courage to testify against her attacker. The fraud victim who rebuilt his business from nothing. Each success story reminded me that healing wasn't just possible, it was inevitable for people who had the support and resources they needed to recover. 6 months into the job, I was asked to speak at a conference for criminal justice professionals about the victim's perspective on long-term criminal investigations. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience of prosecutors, investigators, and victim advocates, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Ryan's death: pride in who I was becoming. When my husband was murdered, I thought my life was over. I thought the lies he'd told and the secrets he'd kept had destroyed any possibility of happiness or normalcy. But what I've learned is that surviving trauma doesn't just mean getting through it, it means using what you've learned to help others get through it too. After the speech, a young prosecutor approached me with tears in her eyes. "My father was killed when I was 15, she said. "I became a prosecutor because I wanted to fight for victims like my family. But listening to you talk, I realized I never really processed my own trauma. I've been so focused on helping others that I forgot to heal myself." That conversation reminded me that healing isn't a destination, it's an ongoing process that deepens and evolves as we grow. My work with other victims wasn't separate from my own recovery, it was the continuation of it. The job offer letter that had arrived on that ordinary Tuesday morning hadn't just given me employment. It had given me purpose, community, and a way to transform my worst experience into something that could help other people survive their own worst experiences. For the first time since Ryan's death, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The letter from another victim arrived on a day when I desperately needed to remember that I wasn't alone in my experience. It was addressed to me at the Victim Advocacy Center, written in careful handwriting that reminded me of the letters my grandmother used to send. "Dear Ms. Walsh," it began. "I watched your interview on the news about spousal deception and criminal cases. I've never written to someone I don't know before, but your story sounds so much like mine that I had to reach out." The letter was from Janet Morrison, a woman in Oregon whose husband of 15 years had been arrested for embezzling $2 million from his employer. Like me, she'd discovered that the man she'd married had been living a completely fabricated life, using their relationship as cover for criminal activities she'd known nothing about. "For months after his arrest, I blamed myself," Janet wrote. "How could I have been married to someone for 15 years without knowing he was stealing money every day? What kind of wife doesn't notice that her husband is a criminal?" But reading about your experience helped me understand that we weren't naive, we were targeted by people who were skilled at deception. Janet's letter led to a phone conversation that lasted 3 hours, during which we compared notes about the red flags we'd missed, the self-doubt we'd experienced, and the slow process of rebuilding our identities after discovering that our marriages had been built on lies. "The hardest part for me was realizing that I'd never actually known my husband at all," Janet said. "I mourned him like he'd died. But then I felt guilty about mourning someone who'd caused so much pain. How do you grieve for someone who never really existed?" Her question perfectly captured the complex emotional landscape that spouses of criminals have to navigate. We weren't just dealing with betrayal, we were dealing with a form of psychological trauma that most people couldn't understand. That conversation with Janet inspired me to start a support group for people who discovered criminal deception in their closest relationships. The first meeting, held in a community room at the local library, attracted 7 people who'd found each other through online forums and word of mouth. There was Margaret, whose husband had been running a Ponzi scheme that destroyed the retirement savings of dozens of their friends. Tom, whose wife had been embezzling from the charity where she worked. Lisa, whose partner had been manufacturing methamphetamine in their garage while she thought he was working late at his office job. Each story was different in its details, but the emotional themes were universal: the shock of discovery, the humiliation of being deceived, the fear that others would judge them for not knowing, and the complicated grief of losing someone who'd never really existed. "I keep having dreams where my husband is still the person I thought he was," Margaret shared during our third meeting. "In the dreams, we're happy together, and the criminal stuff never happened. I wake up feeling guilty for missing someone who caused so much pain." The group became a safe space where we could express feelings that seemed contradictory to outsiders. We could miss the good memories while acknowledging that they were based on lies. We could feel angry about being deceived while also feeling grateful to have escaped dangerous situations. We could rebuild our lives while still processing the trauma of having our previous lives revealed as fiction. Over time, the group evolved from a support circle into something more active. We began advocating for other victims, helping them navigate legal proceedings, and working to change laws that didn't adequately protect spouses of criminals from financial and legal consequences. One of our biggest victories was helping to pass state legislation that protected innocent spouses from civil asset forfeiture. Previously, government agencies could seize jointly owned property even when one spouse had no knowledge of criminal activity. Our advocacy helped establish legal protections for people in our situation. The connections I made through the support group reminded me that trauma could be isolating, but it could also create bonds between people who might never have met under other circumstances. Some of my closest friendships now were with people who understood exactly what it felt like to discover that your entire life had been built on someone else's lies. 6 months after receiving Janet's letter, I was invited to speak at a national conference about victim advocacy. The audience included prosecutors, social workers, therapists, and victim advocates from across the country. Standing at the podium, I looked out at the crowd and saw Janet in the third row, smiling encouragingly. She'd driven 8 hours to attend the conference, bringing 2 other members of her own support group that had formed after our initial conversation. 3 years ago, I thought I was the only person who'd ever been married to a criminal without knowing it, I began. I thought my experience was so unusual, so shameful, that no one else could possibly understand what I was going through. But I've learned that spousal deception in criminal cases is far more common than most people realize, and the victims of that deception need specialized support that our current systems don't provide. After my presentation, I was approached by dozens of people who had similar stories or who worked with victims facing comparable situations. A prosecutor from Texas told me about a case where a woman had been charged as an accessory to her husband's drug trafficking operation, even though evidence showed she'd been completely unaware of his activities. "We need advocates like you," she said. "People who understand that being married to a criminal doesn't make you a criminal, and that discovering criminal deception is its own form of victimization." The conference led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies that were trying to improve their response to cases involving spousal deception. I found myself traveling to different states, training investigators and prosecutors about the unique needs of victims who discovered criminal activity in their closest relationships. Each consultation reminded me how far I'd come from the broken woman who'd found threatening notes on her car windshield. I was now someone who could help shape policy, influence investigations, and ensure that other victims received better support than I'd initially gotten. But perhaps the most meaningful connection came from an unexpected source. During a training session in Denver, I met Special Agent Rodriguez, one of the FBI agents who'd worked on Ryan's case. "I've been following your advocacy work," he said after my presentation. "I wanted you to know that your husband's evidence is still being used to prosecute criminals across multiple jurisdictions. His sacrifice continues to make a difference." For the first time in 3 years, I felt proud of Ryan's memory rather than complicated about it. His choices had cost him his life and shattered mine, but they'd also protected countless other people from becoming victims of the criminal network he'd helped destroy. Agent Rodriguez's words helped me understand that my advocacy work wasn't separate from Ryan's undercover investigation, it was the continuation of it. He'd fought to protect innocent people from criminal organizations. I was fighting to protect innocent spouses from being victimized by criminal justice systems that didn't understand their situations. Janet's letter had started as a simple expression of solidarity between 2 women who'd survived similar trauma. But it had grown into a network of survivors, advocates, and professionals working to ensure that no one had to navigate criminal spousal deception alone. The connections I'd made through that work had given me something I'd lost when Ryan died: a sense of community and purpose that was entirely my own, built on honesty and shared experience rather than lies and deception. The memorial stone I carried up to Devil's Canyon was small enough to fit in my backpack, but it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Simple granite, polished smooth, with an inscription that had taken me months to decide on: Ryan Walsh. Husband, informant, flawed hero. The drive to the canyon had given me hours to think about this moment, about what it meant to return to the place where my old life had ended and my new one had begun. The desert landscape looked exactly the same as it had 4 years ago, but I saw it through completely different eyes now. Where I'd once seen only desolation and danger, I now saw the stark beauty of a place that had tested me and ultimately transformed me. 3 years had passed since I'd last been to this place, 3 years since I'd dug up the buried money that had started my journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Coming back felt like completing a circle I'd never intended to draw. The park rangers at the entrance had recognized my name when I'd signed in, remembering me as the widow from the high-profile case that had made national news. Their expressions had been sympathetic but professional, and I'd appreciated that they hadn't asked questions about why I was returning to the site of such personal trauma. The trail to the overlook was better maintained than it had been during my desperate search years ago. More signs, clearer paths, evidence that this remote wilderness was slowly being tamed for public access. But the wildness of the place remained intact, and I was glad for that. Devil's Canyon needed to stay a little dangerous, a little untamed. It was part of what made it sacred. The hike to the overlook where Ryan died was easier this time. I was stronger now, both physically and emotionally, and I knew the terrain. But as I approached the cliff edge where his body had been found, the memories hit me with unexpected force. I'd prepared for this moment through months of therapy sessions, carefully working through the emotions I expected to feel when I returned to this place. But no amount of preparation could have readied me for the complex mixture of grief, anger, acceptance, and strange gratitude that washed over me as I stood where Ryan had died. The canyon was beautiful in a way I'd been too traumatized to notice during my previous visits. Rock formations painted in shades of red and gold caught the afternoon light, creating shadows that shifted and danced across the landscape. Birds called to each other from hidden perches, their voices echoing off the canyon walls in a natural symphony that spoke of life continuing despite human tragedy. Standing at the spot where my husband had spent his final moments, I tried to imagine what those last minutes had been like. Had he known he was going to die? Had he thought about me? Had he regretted the choices that had led him to this remote canyon, or had he been focused on the greater good he thought he was serving? The memorial stone felt warm in my hands as I found the perfect spot for it, a flat area about 50 yards from the cliff edge, positioned so that it would catch the morning sun. Not where tourists would stumble across it, but not hidden either. A quiet acknowledgement of a complicated man who died in a complicated way. As I set the stone in place, I found myself speaking aloud for the first time since his funeral. I understand now why you did it, I said to the empty canyon. I understand that you were trying to protect people, trying to make up for the harm you'd caused by working with those criminals in the first place. I understand that you loved me enough to risk everything to get out of that life. The wind carried my words away, but saying them felt important anyway. After years of therapy and reflection, I'd finally reached a place where I could acknowledge the complexity of Ryan's motivations without excusing the harm his deception had caused. But I also understand that you lied to me for years. You put me in danger without my knowledge or consent. You made choices about our life together without including me in the decision-making process. You treated me like someone who needed to be protected rather than someone who deserved to know the truth. The conversation felt both one-sided and strangely interactive. The canyon's echoes created a natural call-and response that made it seem like the landscape itself was participating in my final dialogue with Ryan's memory. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals that rose from the canyon floor. I watched it for a long time, thinking about perspective and how different things looked when you could see the whole landscape instead of just the immediate terrain. I've forgiven you, I continued, surprised by how true the words felt as I spoke them. Not because what you did was okay, but because carrying anger about it was hurting me more than it was hurting you. You're dead, and I'm alive, and I refuse to let your mistakes define the rest of my life. The forgiveness wasn't for Ryan, it was for me. It was the final step in reclaiming my own story from the narrative of deception and betrayal that had defined me for so long. Dr. Chen had warned me that forgiveness couldn't be forced or scheduled, that it would come naturally when I was ready for it. Standing in this place where Ryan had died, I finally understood what she'd meant. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or excusing. It meant releasing the emotional weight that had been anchoring me to the past. It meant accepting that Ryan's choices were his own, that his deception was about his limitations rather than my worth, and that I could honor the good memories of our relationship without being defined by its foundation of lies. I'd spent 3 years learning to separate the Ryan I'd loved from the Connor Hayes who'd been a criminal. I'd learned that it was possible to grieve for the good memories while acknowledging that they'd been built on lies. I'd learned that loving someone didn't mean excusing their choices, and that being deceived didn't make me complicit in their crimes. But most importantly, I'd learned that my identity wasn't dependent on my relationship with Ryan. I wasn't just the widow of a federal informant or the woman who brought down a drug network. I was Autumn Walsh, victim advocate, survivor, and someone who'd built a meaningful life from the wreckage of her previous existence. The memorial stone looked right in its new home, neither hidden nor prominent, but simply present. Like Ryan's memory in my life, no longer dominating every thought, but not erased either. A permanent part of my story that no longer controlled the plot. As I prepared to hike back down the canyon, I realized that this would probably be my last visit to this place. I'd said what I needed to say, forgiven what I needed to forgive, and honored the complicated truth of our relationship. The chapter of my life that had begun with Ryan's death was finally, truly complete. The hawk was still circling when I shouldered my backpack and started the long walk back to my car. But now it seemed less like a lonely predator and more like a guardian, keeping watch over the canyon and the memorial stone that marked both an ending and a beginning point. 3 years ago, I'd come to Devil's Canyon as a desperate widow looking for answers about my husband's secret life. Today, I was leaving as a confident woman who'd found her own purpose and identity. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been complete. Ryan's story was over, but mine was just beginning. The new wedding ring I slipped onto my finger wasn't traditional, it was a simple band of rose gold that I'd designed myself, engraved with coordinates that marked not where I'd been, but where I was going. The ceremony was small, attended only by my closest friends from the victim advocacy community and presided over by Dr. Chen, who'd become licensed to perform weddings specifically for this occasion. The venue itself was symbolic, the community garden behind the center where I'd held my first support group meeting. The space had been transformed over the years from a neglected patch of weeds into a thriving garden that provided fresh vegetables for local food banks. It seemed like the perfect metaphor for transformation, for taking something broken and turning it into something that nourished others. Today, we gather to witness Autumn's marriage to herself, she began, her voice carrying the same warmth that had guided me through 3 years of healing. This ceremony represents her commitment to honoring her own worth, trusting her own judgment, and building a life based on authenticity rather than the expectations of others. The idea for the self-marriage ceremony had come from Janet, who'd attended a similar ritual in Oregon after completing her own recovery journey. It wasn't about rejecting the possibility of future romantic relationships, it was about establishing a foundation of self-respect and independence that would make any future partnership an addition to my life rather than a completion of it. Standing in the garden behind the community center where I'd held my first support group meeting, I looked out at the faces of people who'd become my chosen family. Maria, my first client, who'd rebuilt her life after her husband's murder and was now training to become a victim advocate herself. Tom, whose wife's embezzlement case had bankrupted him but who'd found meaning in financial counseling for other fraud victims. Margaret, who'd started a foundation to help families affected by Ponzi schemes. Janet had flown in from Oregon, bringing with her 3 members of the support group we'd started through our correspondence 3 years ago. They represented dozens of similar groups that had formed across the country, connected by online forums and annual conferences that had grown from our initial conversations about spousal deception and criminal discovery. Agent Rodriguez was there, too, along with 2 other FBI agents who'd worked on cases stemming from Ryan's original investigation. Their presence felt like an acknowledgement that my journey from victim to advocate was connected to Ryan's work as an informant, that we'd both, in our different ways, been fighting to protect innocent people from criminal harm. These were people who understood that healing wasn't a destination but a continuous choice, that strength could emerge from the most devastating circumstances, and that the worst experiences of our lives could become the foundation for the most meaningful work we'd ever do. I, Autumn, promised to trust my own instincts and honor my own needs, I said, reading from vows I'd written over several weeks of careful reflection. I promised to build relationships based on honesty and mutual respect. I promised to remember that I am complete on my own, worthy of love and respect regardless of my relationship status. The ring felt perfect on my finger, not a symbol of ownership or commitment to another person, but a reminder of the promises I'd made to myself about how I wanted to live. After the ceremony, as we shared cake and stories in the golden afternoon light, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 4 years ago, I'd been a naive wife who'd trusted blindly and asked few questions. 3 years ago, I'd been a devastated widow who discovered that her entire marriage had been built on lies. 2 years ago, I'd been an angry survivor struggling to rebuild her identity from nothing. Today, I was a woman who'd transformed her worst experience into a calling that helped others survive their own worst moments. I'd built a career from my trauma, a community from my isolation, and a sense of purpose from my pain. The Victim Advocacy Center where I worked had expanded to include specialized programs for families affected by criminal deception. We'd helped change laws in 12 states, influenced prosecutorial practices across federal jurisdictions, and created support networks for people whose situations were too complex for traditional victim services. The program I developed had been replicated in cities across the country, reaching hundreds of people who'd found themselves in situations similar to mine, but the work had changed me in ways I was still discovering. Every client I helped, every law I helped change, every support group I facilitated added another layer to my understanding of resilience and recovery. I'd learned that healing wasn't a destination but a skill set, something that could be practiced, refined, and taught to others. But perhaps more importantly, I'd learned to spot the red flags I'd missed with Ryan. The financial secrecy, the emotional manipulation, the way deceptive people isolated their victims from support systems that might ask uncomfortable questions. I developed an internal warning system that would protect me from ever being that vulnerable again. The romantic relationship I'd begun 6 months earlier with David, a social worker I'd met at a conference, was built on principles I'd never understood during my marriage to Ryan. Complete honesty about our pasts, our fears, and our expectations. Respect for each other's independence and professional commitments. The understanding that we were two complete people choosing to share our lives, not two incomplete people trying to become whole through relationship. David had known about Ryan from our first conversation. He'd read the news coverage, understood the complexity of my situation, and respected the boundaries I'd established around discussing my past. He'd never tried to compete with Ryan's memory or rush me toward commitments I wasn't ready to make. I've never been married to someone who was already married to herself, he joked after learning about my self-marriage plans. But I think it's the healthiest thing I've ever heard. As the sun set on my wedding day, I looked around at the community I'd built and the life I'd created, and I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Ryan's death: complete contentment. With who I was and where I was going, the coordinates engraved on my ring marked the location where I'd first spoken publicly about my experience, not Devil's Canyon, where my old life had ended, but the conference center where my new life had truly begun. They were a reminder that my story wasn't defined by what had been done to me, but by what I'd chosen to do in response. To anyone facing a similar journey of discovery and recovery, I want you to know that the person who deceived you doesn't get to write the ending of your story. The lies they told don't define your worth, and the trust they violated doesn't have to make you afraid to trust again. You are stronger than you know, more resilient than you believe, and capable of building a life more authentic and meaningful than anything you've lost. Your worst experience can become the foundation for your greatest contribution to the world. The ring on my finger catches the light as I write these final words, a daily reminder that I am complete, worthy, and free to write whatever comes next. Tomorrow, I'll return to work, helping other people navigate the complex landscape of criminal victimization and spousal deception. Next month, I'll speak at a conference in Chicago about trauma-informed victim advocacy. Next year, I'm planning to write a book about the unique challenges faced by families of criminal informants. But tonight, surrounded by the people who've become my chosen family, wearing a ring that symbolizes my commitment to my own worth and authenticity, I'm exactly where I need to be. The coordinates engraved on my wedding band mark the beginning of the next chapter of my life, a chapter I'll write entirely on my own terms, informed by my past but not controlled by it. Anyone reading this who finds themselves facing a similar journey of discovery and recovery, I want you to know that the person who deceived you doesn't get to write the ending of your story. The lies they told don't define your worth, and the trust they violated doesn't have to make you afraid to trust again. You are stronger than you know, more resilient than you believe, and capable of building a life more authentic and meaningful than anything you've lost. Your worst experience can become the foundation for your greatest contribution to the world, if you choose to let it.